Do you play JRPGs? Normally, I don't, but I've been playing a bunch of them lately to find ones that are actually doing something interesting with turn-based combat. Indie games have to innovate to stand out, and that's exactly what I'm searching for. Mechanics that try to push the genre forward. Today, I'd love to share what I've found. How these games use unique design mechanics to create gameplay that expands on turn-based combat. Why they work so well, or in some cases why they don't, and how you can take inspiration from them to make your game more fun and ultimately more successful. Let's get into it. Cassette Beasts is a turn-based combat RPG that centers around collecting monsters which get stored on cassettes, and then transforming into those monsters to fight enemies. Your goal is to collect a team of monsters that you can pull from and create a roster to play as you defeat bad guys. As soon as I saw this, I knew I had to check it out. I mean, cassette tapes, Walkmans, the whole retro vibe. I grew up with a Sony Walkman on my hip, so I was just kind of in. I love it when games take on really unusual concepts like this. Yes, it's got a lot of obvious Pokemon vibes, but I think that's okay. It's hard not to with any kind of creature collecting game. It's not just the theme that I enjoyed though, it's got some really sharp gameplay systems. The fusion system allows you to combine your team mid-battle with some kiss-curse elements. All of your creatures scale based on your character's level, which reduces the typical grinding required to level up every creature. And of course, storing creatures on cassette tapes. What's not to love about that? But what I found the most fascinating was how they decided to implement their chemistry or types system. Elemental types are pretty common in games like this. They define a rock, paper, scissors style relationship between creatures and abilities. Every creature and ability in the game is categorized into a type, which represents a defining characteristic, like fire or water. These types then have a relationship to each other, either strong, neutral, or weak. For example, fire is strong against ice, water is strong against fire. Many creature collectors, or generally role-playing games, have systems like this, and typically they are implemented as straight damage multipliers. If a relationship is strong, then the attacker does a large amount of damage to the other. The purpose of these type systems is to create more depth, a more interesting choice when deciding on what your team makeup is. If you know you're battling a boss with a dominant type, you can construct your team to beat it. Cassette Beasts goes further with their system though. They go beyond just damage multipliers. Instead, they implemented a system that uses buffs, debuffs, and transmutes. Just like in the damage multiplier system, it's all based on relationships. In a situation where the relationship is strong, say water versus fire, a debuff is applied, which extinguishes the fire type, reducing its attack stats for a number of turns. In a situation where the attacker is weak, a buff is applied. For example, using a fire-type move on a water-type monster gives it a shroud of steam that passively heals it. Based on the relationship, a type can also transmute another type. When a fire type attacks a plastic type monster, the plastic melts, transmuting it into a poison type for the rest of the combat. This, of course, can be used to create a new opportunity to apply new debuffs to a creature that was previously immune. So, all this is neat, but this seems way more complicated, right? Why do we care about this change? Well, a damage multiplier is great, but it's a binary system. It either happens or it doesn't, and the result is always focused on a single variable, the creature's health. This will only speed up or slow down combat. Finishing combat is, of course, the ideal state, but a binary system has very few potential interactions with other mechanics. By leveraging a buff system, the game brings in a more variable system that can have many interactions. buffs can impact damage done, but they can also have a wild variety of other effects. A buff can do a dot, it can heal, it can reflect a % of damage done, it can heal all friendly creatures, it can increase the attack speed, it can increase the chance to dodge or even miss attacks. Yes, inevitably these all end up affecting health, either directly or indirectly, but based on your other systems, they can cause a lot of interesting interactions. The critical element here is that beyond being a variable system, buffs also persist over a number of turns. It's not just something which happens once. Your other creatures can play off of this state. This is what unlocks the potential for interactions. I mean, just the way that you can attack one of your own creatures and cause those buffs or transmutes to apply is a perfect example of this potential interaction. Fundamentally, by going with a non-binary system, they've added a really compelling amount of depth to the team creation moment. Players aren't just looking at the team roster and figuring out what will do more damage. They're looking at what kind of buffs and debuffs can be applied, and how, if at all, they can play off each other. Given that Cassette Beasts is, at its core, a team builder, this leans really hard into the core fantasy for the audience. What these players are looking for is the reward of seeing one of their team builds play off really big in combat. And this system heavily reinforces that. This is all supported by the relationships generally making sense. I mean, except for glitter. The developer clearly put a lot of effort into making sure the relationships between the chemical types all make sense. The buffs and debuffs fit the fantasy. It's all very grokkable, which is really helpful as it ensures that a system like this, which could become quite complex, is understandable. At the very least, when you get hit by a debuff, you look and feel like you should have known that was coming, instead of feeling like you were caught out by some weird alien type interaction. I love this system because it adds a level of depth to the combat which goes way deeper than just damage molds. Yet it's a very simple, delicate change at the same time. Elemental damage types are pretty common in RPGs, but the teeth tends to be taken out of them as hard counters and such are frowned upon. However, you could easily use this type of system in a more traditional RPG or even an ARPG, kind of like an indie version of Baldur's Gate. I could also see how card battlers could integrate this, something like a Slay the Spire type game. And to be completely just strange, imagine doing a similar type-based system with buffs in a sports team management or even a Sims-like game, where instead of elemental, you have personality types, and interactions between various types have positive and negative buffs. Say, someone who is outgoing may have a negative effect on someone who is an introvert. I know I feel that way at parties sometimes. I'm wondering, have you seen a system like this used in any other game? I'd love to hear about it if you have in the comments. Chained Echoes is a very typical take on 16-bit style turn-based JRPG, and if you're into the genre, mate, there's a lot here to love. Very pretty pixel artwork, deep story about a team of heroes battling through a war-torn world, and some wonderfully fun combat mechanics. When I started digging into the game though, what really took me aback was how the whole thing was developed by a single person, Matthias Linder, over the course of 7 years. Talk about dedication, right? Overall, there's quite a few effective design mechanics to note here. The tagging system is quite special as it allows you to pair up your characters in your roster and swap them out. This adds a dimension of choice while also restricts the player, forcing some hard choices. I'm a huge fan of hard choices in game design. What really stood out to me is what they call the overdrive bar. And based on the internet, I'm not the only one it stood out to. The overdrive bar is, well, it's a literal bar that's always present during combat in the top left corner of the screen. It's split into yellow, green, and red sections and has an indicator on it to tell you where you currently are on the bar. Think like a big thermometer. When your characters perform an action, they either move the bar to the left or the right. When the indicator is in the yellow, there's no effect. In the green, all of the team's abilities cost less resources and deal more damage. In the red, all abilities cost more resources and do more damage. If you hadn't guessed yet, you want to stay in the green. Red is dead. All of the team's abilities are broken up into categories, which, if you play these games much, will be pretty obvious. Things like attack, defensive, utility. Attacks generally move you towards the red, defense moves you to the yellow. Use too many offensive abilities in a row and you'll find yourself in the red really quickly. On top of all that, to the left-hand side of the bar is displayed an icon which represents an ability type and how many turns that will be present. While that ability type is there, any abilities of that type cast will move you to the left regardless of what they would normally do. So if the overdrive ability is attack, attacks will now move you to the left instead of the right. The goal for the player is to stay in the green for as long as possible. They do this by trying to balance what abilities they use and when, weaving in offensive and defensive. The core intent of this system is to try to stop players from just spamming the same ability again and again, which I guess it does. To be totally honest though, I don't love the system. I totally see what the developer is trying to accomplish, and I think that aspiration is admirable. Turn-based RPGs can often devolve into spam matches where the player has determined the optimal ability to use and they just hammer that one as often as they can. I applaud the developer for trying to solve the problem, but the implementation is lacking. As implemented, the system is overly controlling on the player's actions. Unless you can perfectly control the bar, you're heavily punished for using an ability which might push you into the red. And there are many times that this can happen. Often, you really need to use an ability to finish off an enemy, but due to the bar, you're punished for doing this. You're forced to make a decision to either suffer through another round of combat with that enemy active, or be punished for being in the red. This results in finding yourself forced to use filler abilities, such as buffs when you don't really need to, just to manage the overdrive bar. The way it's implemented, the player too often feels like they're making a bad choice. The player's often playing the bar in combat more than they're playing combat and fighting enemies. So what would I do as an alternative? At Blizzard, we had a saying, make it a bonus. Much of game design is about making the player do what we want them to do. And it's relatively easy to develop systems which punish the player for performing actions that the game designer considers bad. Take the circles in PUBG. What the game is doing is forcing players together, because the best way to survive is to stay far away from each other and hide in a bush. The game forces players to move by creating an ever-shrinking circle of death which forces them together. And death is the ultimate example of a system which tells players, don't do that. Game designers want the player to know it's bad to take damage, so we kill them when they do. It teaches them to avoid taking damage. We've found ways to scale the impact of this based on the audience, all the way from a rogue game where you lose all of your equipment and progress when you die, to a Lego game where death is a minor inconvenience as you respawn almost instantly and quickly recover your progress. With the overdrive bar, the developer doesn't want the player to constantly repeat their abilities, so they created a system which punishes the player if they do. Yes, there's a reward there, but it's too quick to punish. It rarely feels like a bonus to stay in the green. More of the focus is on staying out of the red. But how would we make it a bonus? How would we reward the player for doing this, yet not create a sense of being over-controlling and punishing them? A much softer system might be something where if the player does cast a spell which isn't the same as the previous one, they get a stacking buff. Every time they cast a spell that's a different type than the last one, the buff gains an extra stack. The buff reduces the cost of the next ability cast and maxes out at a certain number of stacks. Maybe it's just a way to progressively power up for a big ability. Use the same concept as a bar, but instead of trying to keep in a zone, whenever you use an ability that's different to the previous one, you just fill up the bar. When it's full, there's a way to cast one of your spells that uses that as a bonus resource to spend on a big version of the attack. I know these might not be the best ideas, but at the end of the day, they're accomplishing the same result, and they're an example of alternatives that could also work. They are showing the player, hey, it's better to use a variety of attacks, but rather than punishing them when they don't, they're rewarding them for when they do. Sea of Stars is a game you've probably heard of. In fact, it's so well known that I wasn't sure if I should include it or not. But then I played it, and it nails so many little things so well that I'm not surprised about why it's so popular, and I just had to share some thoughts on it. If you haven't heard of it, on the surface, it's a really beautiful, retro-inspired JRPG with all the trappings you'd expect. A big story to defeat an ancient hero, pixel graphics, turn-based gameplay. But the beauty of it is in the details and how they've approached their combat system. And honestly, there's so much here that it's hard to focus down on just one mechanic, so I'm just gonna go through a few. The relics are items that you can find in the world that let you change how the game plays. Think of these like a difficulty system, almost like Bastion's shrine system. It's not just combat difficulty though. You can also affect mechanics like fishing and such. I love this. It connects the game systems to the world. It's relatively simple and easy for the developer to create. It just makes the whole game feel way more connected. Best yet, this is also something that big AAA studios are really unlikely to do. Like many RPGs, when one of your characters gets knocked out in combat, you can revive them, but there's a cute way of doing it here. To indicate that your character is knocked out, they get animated stars around their head. Each turn that the character is knocked out, one of those stars disappears. If your other characters can defend them for enough turns, all the stars go away, the character recovers. It's such a wonderfully simple UI solution. It's kind of what we call diegetic user interface, or where the information that the player needs in order to make decisions is displayed in the game itself, rather than on some heads-up display or overlay. Likely inspired by Mario RPG, Sea of Stars also has a timed attack and block system. When your characters perform attacks or are attacked, the player is given the option to press a button within a window to power up or add to the attack. Integrating this adds a level of engagement when you're in combat. Rather than just sitting back and watching the turn happen, you can be an active part of the game. These are all fantastic systems, but what I found the most interesting is the lock mechanic. Some enemies, when casting spells that take multiple turns to cast, display a sequence of icons and a timer. These icons are locks, and they represent an ability type. If the creature is hit with that ability type, the lock is broken. For each lock that's broken, the power of the spell is reduced. If all the locks are broken, the spell is interrupted. And that's what this is. It's an interrupt mechanic that has a layered level of depth associated with it. There are so many reasons I appreciate this. First, it encourages the player to pause before they cast an attack. It makes you think about what you should attack next, what ability to use, beyond just burning down a single enemy. It also makes you think about the bigger sequence of turns. If you attack and disable some locks with the current character, can you disable the rest of them with the character whose turn it is next? It makes every battle feel like a puzzle you're trying to solve. And yet it's just this simple interrupt thing. I'd actually suggest this is a really strong solution to the whole problem of players just repeat casting the same ability. Much better than the overdrive bar that we just talked about. This added complexity of the lock system works well in turn-based games because players can, and almost have to, pause to figure out how to solve for it, especially because the way to break it often requires multiple characters to solve. Obviously, this kind of system would adapt to work well in games like XCOM, but I also wonder if there's something here that could work well in fighting games like Street Fighter. Obviously, it would be a big departure for them, but if you were doing something indie in that space, there might be room to experiment. Say, when you get an advantage on the enemy player, there can be a system such as this to follow up and finish them, or if you're able to hit them in the right sequence. Though this may end up feeling too much like a QuickTime event, I suppose. I wonder if you could build this into a Max Payne style slow time mechanic. Maybe a game like Control could implement something like this as part of their magic system. Of course, this could translate well into a lockpicking system, something where you have a timed element, which would add pressure. To be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of JRPGs, but I really enjoyed delving into these to try and find mechanics that I could learn from. This is a practice that I found to be quite valuable as a game designer, especially as it can unlock some new ideas to try in other genres that I might be working in. I hope this has inspired you, maybe given you a new idea or two for your game. Hey, thanks for hanging out today. I had a lot of fun. I'll see you again next time, yeah?